right, this is a drawing of Puddleglum by my 8-year-old daughter, Ruthie. Puddleglum is a character from C.S. Lewis's book, The Silver Chair. You know him as a marshwiggle, right? A marshwiggle in Narnia who joins two children, Jill and Eustace, who've been charged by Aslan to look for the missing Prince Rilian in the underworld. When I was in my first summer of my PhD program in English, I printed images of Puddleglum off the internet and taped them on the walls around my desk. I really needed Puddleglum. During a climactic point of the silver chair, Puddleglum, the two children, and the prince are being enchanted by the queen of the underworld. She throws a green powder on the hearth. She starts playing a stringed instrument, and they start to get kind of drowsy as she sings and asks them some questions. She convinces them that Narnia and Aslan are only in their imagination, because when she asks them to describe Narnia and Aslan, they say things like, well, the sun's like a lamp, and you know what a cat is? Aslan's like a cat. Suddenly, Puddleglum rallies. He marches over to the fire, and with a bare foot, he stamps it out and stamps the burning powder out, and that greenish smoke kind of disappears, and he declares the following. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you come to think about it. We're just babies making things. Making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't an Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. Doesn't that make you want to cheer? What Lewis was doing in that passage was responding to the forces of modernism. The idea that if empirical research did not give obvious and direct evidence of God, then there must not be a God. Just as if the children looked at a cat to explain who Aslan was, then there must not have been an Aslan. In my PhD program, I was in a culture of postmodernism. A few of my professors had reached the excesses of it. One of them said during class that the attack on the Twin Towers during 9/11 was a social construction. He believed that we could not have confident knowledge to say that there was a reality that existed outside of ourselves, including God. In that culture, if I was to promote one overarching story of the world that was better, I was considered arrogant and grabbing for cultural power. But like Puddleglum, I wanted to hold on to that story despite the critique against it. My question was, how to do that? Wasn't it my job to witness to my colleagues? And yet, as I was quickly to find out, most of them had heard the story of the gospel. They just did not believe it. And the way it had been presented to them, they did indeed judge as arrogant. The campus where my PhD program was housed has a large open space similar to our campus green. That space is called the Oak Grove. The building with the English department faces the Oak Grove. On that particular side of the Oak Grove, a small hill called a knoll rises. At the top of the knoll, a patch of grass has been rubbed bare. This is the spot where preachers come from off campus to preach to the students walking by on the sidewalk. As they face the portion of campus where the English department is, they shout toward a sound canyon between two sets of buildings, and their voices bounce back and can be heard all over the oak grove. On the slide up there is one of those preachers. He was not the one I heard, the one who read scriptures about sins that were sending the students to hell. Was this faithful presence? Was this how to share my faith and stand up for truth? This week, the College of Art and Humanities has based their theme of faithful presence on a book by James Davison Hunter, a Christian sociologist. So I have a copy, several of us do, if you want to see it. Hunter points out that the ways conservative Christians have tried to transform culture have been ineffective. For example, instead of staying in institutions of secular art and entertainment, we have started our own. He notes that both the Jewish communities and gay communities, who are minorities in the United States, have had a huge influence on culture because they have remained in those institutions. The culture wars have not worked. As Dr. Matt Miller has said as we prepared for this week of chapel, James Davison Hunter's book, To Change the World, has suggested that believers have often chosen the wrong tools as we attempt to push back the evil and brokenness that surround and sadden us. We have chosen strategies of manipulation over the values of God's kingdom. We have valued celebrity status more than long-term contributions. We have pragmatically viewed our career opportunities as platforms for sharing our own opinions, rather than as settings to reflect his grace, wisdom, and truth. Instead of the culture wars, where it seems as if we are shouting at people, got it? There we go. Instead of the culture wars, where it seems as if we are shouting at people who are not listening, as that campus pastor was, we can have a faithful presence. In the words of Hunter, our calling requires that we be faithfully present through the institutions we live in, the church first and foremost, but other institutions of which we are a part as well. Here too, individually and collectively, we direct ourselves toward the flourishing of others through actions and structures that embody sacrificial love. I'm going to read one more quote by Hunter, and then we'll unpack these. Indeed, when our various tasks are done in ways that acknowledge God, God is present and he is glorified. Such tasks may not be redeeming, but they can provide a foretaste of the coming kingdom. Inquiry, scholarship, and learning with an awareness of the goodness of God's created order is a discovery of what is truly higher in higher education, and not least, reflecting the beauty of God's creation in art or music is nothing less than an act of worship. In short, fidelity, which means faithfulness, to the highest practices of vocation before God, it's consecrated and itself transformational in its effects. So what does it mean to have a faithful presence in today's world? Can we participate in a way that leads to others flourishing? For Hunter, it means not always directly witnessing or those tasks that seem redeeming, but instead showing love through supporting others flourishing and having fidelity to the highest practices of vocation, meaning working hard and with excellence. In my PhD program, it meant being more like the Apostle Paul at Mars Hill in Acts 17. And yet at the same time, not being quite like the Oak Grove preacher I had heard. Paul had been invited to speak at Mars Hill by the philosophers in Athens, just as I had been invited to enter my PhD program after I applied. In his Mars Hill speech, Paul used lines from one of their own philosophers and one of their own poets. In him we live and move and have our being. And, for we are indeed his offspring. He used these lines from them, right, to show them the truth of the gospel. So this is what faithful presence looked like for me in my PhD program. First, and my writing theory students will be familiar with this, right? First, I needed to resonate. I needed to really, truly listen without always arguing. I also needed to affirm what was true and what others said, as the Apostle Paul had done. My colleagues were made in the image of God, so they did have some truths to speak to me. In my class on literacy, missionaries who had brought literacy to indigenous people were attacked for being colonizers. I had to agree that some of those missionaries had done things as my friends had claimed. Sometimes they had enforced Western ways, or even had forced children not to speak their native language in school, as in the case of Native Americans in the U.S. I had to listen deeply to a critique of historical Christianity, and it was really hard. I also affirmed my colleagues' desire to flourish and to help others flourish. Most of my colleagues were deeply invested in providing accessible education for those marginalized in the United States. That was a good thing, and I encouraged them in their endeavors. However, I did not hide my faith. Within a couple weeks, everyone had figured out I was a conservative Christian. I had to resist things I was being taught that were questionable. I asked good questions, and sometimes I was called on to speak Christian truth. In one class, we were discussing different philosophical approaches to our field. My professor wrote several ones on the board and asked us to claim the one we had the most congruency with. We went around in a circle, and I was last. Everyone in my class, including my professor, claimed neo-Marxism. In neo-Marxism, I could agree with components such as the need to critique my own underlying assumptions and the desire to help marginalized peoples, but I could not claim it. Neo-Marxism asserts that we can have no confidence in an outside reality. I said that my approach was the narrative one, the reason being that I am part of an overarching story. Finally, in my program, I also worked very hard. I did good work and was faithful to my calling as a student. Most of my classmates and professors respected my work. An unexpected benefit of having a faithful presence was this. To undergo a critique of Christianity, I had to practice dependence on Jesus in a way I never had before. Like the Father in Mark 9:24, I found myself crying out constantly, "I believe," but then also saying, "Help my unbelief." And I mean it like daily, calling that out. My dissertation advisor said this, "It's not much of a faith if it can't be critiqued." And he was right. My faith became stronger. I became Puddleglum. But the benefit was not just for me. At the end of my first term, I was hanging out at a local pub where my colleagues and I gathered weekly. I did not drink alcohol, just so you know. All right? But meeting at the pub was a way to be in community with my colleagues. That night, so the end of my term, I was sitting with the only other conservative Christian in my program, a man who was a faculty member at Bethany Lutheran College in Mankato. Another friend to whom I had grown close came up to both of us and said, "Okay, you two are both Christians. What's the deal with Jesus? Why is he so important to you?" And then God gave us the opportunity to share our faith directly, witnessing from Scripture. That day, our friend did not proclaim that he turned toward Jesus, but I trust that God has him in a journey and that we played a part. I believe because we had a faithful presence, the kind that James Davison Hunter has promoted, our friend was willing and ready to talk about the gospel in God's own timing.